There is a house with no bricks, no cut stone, no great timber frame holding up its roof. It was built from nothing but grass and dirt. The same dirt you'd scrape off your boots without a second thought. And yet that house stood against North Atlantic winds, strong enough to roll a fishing boat. Through winters so dark, the sun barely cleared the horizon for weeks at a time. It sheltered families for more than 40 generations. 40. That's roughly 1,000 years of storms, of ash falls, of freezing rain driven sideways across an open island. And the grass held. For most of that time, we got the story completely wrong. Historians looked at these homes and called them primitive, the desperate work of settlers who simply ran out of wood. Modern archaeology tells a very different story, and it has the evidence to prove it. These were not shelters. These were survival machines built from living earth, structures that breathed, that grew, that got stronger with every passing year, with a fire burning at the center like a heartbeat. And here's the part that still unsettles researchers today. If you walk the Icelandic countryside now, you can still trace the outlines of these houses in the ground. But what survived isn't the walls. It isn't the roof. What survived is the one part of the house nobody ever saw while people were living in it. Then there's the strangest question of all. Why did they build a home perfectly suited for a winter that hadn't happened yet? To understand that, we have to go back to the year 870 and the last ship leaving Norway. They came carrying everything a life needs to start over. Seed grain wrapped in cloth, sheep and cattle crowded into open boats, iron tools, and the memory of pine forests thick enough to swallow a man's voice. That memory mattered more than they knew. Iceland met them with stone, ash, and wind. It was beautiful in a way that stopped them cold. Steam rising off the ground, black beaches, mountains with no trees to soften them. And that was the problem. There were almost no trees at all. You have to understand what that meant to a Norse family. Wood wasn't a building material to them. Wood was the civilization itself. It carried them across oceans as longships. It held up the great halls where laws were spoken and marriages were made. It framed every roof, every workshop, every temple they had ever prayed in. And now they stood on an island that offered almost none of it. So every single piece became sacred. Beams were repaired instead of replaced. Old buildings weren't torn down. They were carefully taken apart so the timber could live a second life, and sometimes a third. And when driftwood washed ashore, logs that had traveled thousands of miles from the rivers of Siberia or the forests of North America, drifting across the Arctic for years, it was gathered like treasure. Nothing was wasted, because nothing could be. Eventually, they faced a choice that decides the fate of every people who arrive somewhere new. Fight the land, or learn from it. They chose to learn, and that single decision saved them. So they began to look down. Beneath their feet, everywhere, lay something they had walked across for years without truly seeing. Icelandic turf. Not loose soil, but a dense, living fabric of grass roots, moss, volcanic ash, and centuries of slowly decaying plant matter, pressed together by the cold into something startlingly tough. Cut with long iron spades, it came away in enormous slabs that held their shape like giant bricks of earth. The tangled roots worked as natural reinforcement, exactly the way steel works inside concrete. The countless tiny pockets of air trapped between them worked as insulation. What they had discovered, without a word for it, was a natural composite material, a thing modern engineers wouldn't name for another 900 years. Those walls held heat beautifully, almost too beautifully, and that would cost them something no one saw coming.
But discovering turf was only half of the answer, because a wall built several feet thick is also astonishingly heavy. Add a week of rain, add melting snow soaking down through every layer, and the weight climbs into the tons. Left to itself, a wall like that doesn't stand for 1,000 years. It shifts, it settles, it slowly leans. And one winter, it comes down under nothing but its own weight. Strong material alone was never going to be enough. What these families needed was engineering. So they made a decision that would have looked like surrender to their grandparents back home. In Norway, you built upward.
A tall hall was a statement, a way of announcing who you were to anyone crossing the valley. In Iceland, they built downward. Homes were sunk part way into the ground, so the earth itself wrapped around the lower walls. Less surface exposed to the wind meant less for a storm to grab hold of. The surrounding soil held a steady temperature year-round, warming the house in winter and cooling it in the brief northern summer. And the ground anchored the whole structure in place when the gales came. The landscape stopped being the enemy outside and became the fourth wall of the house. Today we call this passive heating and earth-sheltered architecture. They found it with no formulas and no calculations, only patient observation, one winter at a time. But burying a house in soil invites a second enemy. Earth gives you warmth, and earth gives you moisture, and moisture will eat a turf wall from the bottom up. Their solution was so simple, it's easy to miss. Before laying a single slab of turf, they packed a foundation of tightly fitted stones across the entire base of the building. Those stones broke the path of rising damp and created channels for rain and snowmelt to drain away. The turf stayed drier. The walls stayed stronger. The house grew more stable with every year instead of less. And this is where the story reaches back and touches us. Walk an excavation site in Iceland today, and the turf walls are gone, returned to the soil they came from. The roofs are gone, back to being meadow. But the stones are still there, still sitting exactly where a Viking hand set them down more than 1,000 years ago, quietly drawing the outline of a home that no longer exists. The one part of the house nobody ever saw is the only part that outlived everyone who lived in it. Above all of that came the roof, and the roof is where these builders became something close to artists. First, a frame of rafters cut from precious driftwood, every beam a survivor of its own ocean crossing. Over that, overlapping sheets of birch bark, naturally rich in oils, that shed water like a raincoat. And over that, thick slabs of living turf, laid until the roof became a blanket of soil and grass. Then something happened that happens to no other building humans have ever made. Every house on Earth begins dying the day it's finished. This one did the opposite. Each spring, new grass pushed up through the surface. Moss crept across the slope. Roots reached down and stitched the layers together, tighter each season. The roof didn't wear out. It healed. It thickened. It got stronger every single year. These families didn't build a house. They planted one. From a distance, the entire farm simply vanished into the hillside. No walls, no gables, nothing but rolling green. And then, a weathered wooden doorway and a thin ribbon of smoke rising out of the grass, telling you that a family was living down there beneath the earth. And if you stood on that hill, you would not be able to tell which mound belonged to a wealthy chieftain and which belonged to the poorest farmer on the island. That was not an accident, and it would end up reshaping an entire culture. Walls and roofs can only hold warmth. They can't create it. For that, every household on the island depended on one thing: a single fire burning in the middle of the hall. That fire cooked every meal. It dried soaked wool and frozen boots.
And through an Icelandic winter, when the sun barely lifted above the hills for weeks, it was very nearly the only light anyone saw. Everything in the house arranged itself around that glow. Long wooden benches ran along the walls, seats by day and beds by night.
Grandparents, parents, children, hired workers, and sometimes a stranger who had knocked on the door out of a blizzard, all slept in the same room, as close to the coals as space allowed. That's where the stories were told. That's where wool was spun and tools were mended, and news from other farms was traded. Children fell asleep listening to the fire crack and settle, surrounded by the breathing of everyone they belonged to. We think of privacy as a comfort. In a world where the cold could kill you in minutes, closeness wasn't a preference, it was survival. But the house that held heat so perfectly held smoke just as perfectly. That was the cost no one had planned for. Open the roof vent wide, and the warmth of an entire day poured out in minutes, along with snow blowing in. So families kept the opening small and lived beneath a thin layer of smoke hanging under the rafters, day after day, winter after winter. The evidence is still there. Heavy soot coats the surviving timbers pulled from these houses, and researchers believe generations of early Icelanders carried chronic lung problems because of it. Outside, the wind could take a life in minutes. Inside, the smoke collected quietly, a little each day, across an entire lifetime. And the main hall was only the center of something larger. Around it stood storerooms packed with dried fish, smoked lamb, grain, and preserved dairy. Workrooms for spinning and weaving. Small forges where driftwood and iron became tools. Animal shelters built close by, because the body heat of sheep and cattle was itself a source of warmth. Wherever possible, these buildings were linked by enclosed passages, for one blunt reason. In a whiteout blizzard, 10 steps across open ground could be the last 10 steps you ever took. Which brings us back to that hillside, and the thing you couldn't tell from looking. In Norway, power announced itself. Carved pillars, towering halls, timber displayed like jewelry. In Iceland, nature raised all of it. Chieftain or farmhand, nearly everyone lived beneath the same grass roof, built from the same turf and the same stone. The weather didn't care about rank. The wind didn't read family names. The cold treated everyone exactly the same. So wealth had to be measured somewhere else. In the health of your livestock, the strength of your family, and whether you were ready for the next winter. Cooperation became more valuable than power. Real skill mattered more than display. The land taught them humility, and the ones who accepted the lesson were the ones still standing in spring. For most of the last 1,000 years, these homes were dismissed as the crude work of people with nothing better. Today, archaeologists, architects, and environmental engineers look at the same buildings and use a very different phrase: climate-adapted design.
Full-scale reconstructions have shown that a properly built turf house holds its heat remarkably well, stands up to North Atlantic gales, and burns noticeably less fuel through a wooden house of the same period. Nothing in it was wasted. No part of it existed without a reason. The walls, the sunken floor, the stone foundation, the living roof, the fire at the center. None of them worked alone. They worked as one system, and that is why the system lasted. Which finally answers the question we started with. When these houses reached their finished form, the worst winters had not arrived yet. Centuries later, the North Atlantic slid into a longer, colder, more violent stretch of weather that we now call the Little Ice Age. Those settlers never heard that name. They had no climate models, no records, no way to see what was coming. But they lived by a principle that did the work anyway. Build for a future harsher than the present you're standing in. And when that future came, Their grandchildren were already inside a house designed to meet it. That principle never expired. The green roofs going up across Scandinavia today, earth-sheltered homes, passive design, all of it is a rediscovery of a lesson a group of exiles learned by watching wind and grass. You don't need a frozen island to use it. You only need to ask the question honestly. Am I building for today or for the winter that hasn't come yet? The Vikings are remembered for what they conquered. But their most durable legacy isn't a battle, a ship, or a bloodline. It's a grass-covered roof, still faintly outlined in the Icelandic soil. The greatest civilizations aren't always the ones that take the most land. Sometimes they're the ones who learned how to live with it. If this stayed with you, stay with us. Next, we go west to the conical lodges of the Great Plains and to the Athabascan homes built to hold a family through 40 degrees below zero.